want to thank the library, I want to thank Lisa, I want to thank Kai, I want to thank everybody for being here. And what I want to do today, I really thought about it since Kai had contacted me. How exactly will I do this? Will I do more of a presentation with a bunch of slides? Will I do more of a conversation? And I said, I'm not a slides person. The last time I did this, I talked with the people, and this is what I do with my students in my class. So I really want to talk to you all about this issue that is pressing. Even though it's 100 years ago, birth of a nation, the whole idea of the influence of entertainment, or sometimes what passes as entertainment, on our political discourse and the realities of our politics really started back then, and it still lives with us today. And I mean, it relates to issues along lines of race and gender and perceptions of the Civil War and perceptions of social class. All these things are influenced in us by the entertainment that sometimes we choose to partake in, and sometimes the entertainment that is just put before our eyes and before the eyes of our young people and people of all ages. But when we think about Birth of a Nation, Woodrow Wilson, to paraphrase him, President of the United States at the time, he had a screening of Birth of a Nation at the White House, and he said basically it was history written in lightning. And I always tell my students that I have, kind of a love-hate relationship with Woodrow Wilson, because yes, Woodrow Wilson was one of our great presidents. Woodrow Wilson was one of the forefathers of the academic discipline of political science. But Woodrow Wilson also was, historically documented as a stone-cold racist. Woodrow Wilson had ties to the Ku Klux Klan. Woodrow Wilson had a screening of Birth of a Nation at the White House, a film that basically glorifies the Ku Klux Klan at a time where it had basically gone out of existence. And he solidifies it and really ends up saying, hey, this is a great thing. This is a wonderful thing. So it's for all the good that he did, in particular all the good that he did in terms of paving the way for my discipline and paving the way for my work as a political scientist. He also did a lot to, slow down progress or work against progress when it came to issues related to marginalized groups, in particular black folks in the United States of America. So when we think about who was president at the time, when we're talking about Birth of a Nation, we're talking about that time in our history. When we start talking about, in that time period, those years, not only just 1915, in that time period, but also the release of this film. When we start thinking about where our nation was and where our nation is, yes, we definitely have grown. We definitely have a lot of differences, but we also are dealing with some of the same issues. Just this week, we have this big, or last week and this week, Anonymous. If some of you may have heard of this online group, Anonymous, they've decided that they're going to release, and they have been releasing, they've been hacking into computers of Ku Klux Klan groups and leaking information of people who at least supposedly are members of Klan or Klan-related organizations. And some of them are elected officials or supposedly elected officials. Some of them are prominent members of communities. So we still have the Klan with us. We still have vestiges of division, vestiges of racism. We also have this whole idea of this influence of popular culture on the decisions that we make as a society, on the decisions and the discourse, the discussions that we have as a society, particularly when it comes to issues of race. So from a quick show of hands, how many people have at least heard of or seen a clip of or saw some discussion of the film from 1915, Birth of a Nation? Okay, so most people in here have heard something about it. A few people have not heard anything about it. All right, so what I wanted to do, and hopefully I picked the right one. Here we go. All right, what I wanted to do, and I hope the internet agrees with us, is I just wanted to take a few minutes to get us all on the same page, okay? Doesn't feel fair to talk about Birth of a Nation without having some background on it. Obviously, the film's 3 hours, so I don't think anybody in here is about to sit through 3 hours of a film from 1915. So if you'd like to do it, it's widely available online. You can see it on YouTube. You can, see it a million other places. But here, I want to show you all a quick clip Birth of a Nation in 8 minutes, and you know, we may cut it a little shorter than 8 minutes, but I definitely want you to get the idea of what's going on when it comes to Birth of a Nation and the legacy that's been left by this as well as other elements of entertainment, particularly in the way in which they portray race and the way in which they portray race relations, and how it ends up being reflected in actual politics, in applied politics.
We are adrift here in a sea of blood, and I want to end.
Movies have the power to make history come alive. They can recreate the battles of the Civil War, or place us right there at the Allied invasion of D-Day. Now, we can read about history, we can research history, but because they can recreate the worlds of the past, historical movies can actually place us there. Now, in the year 1915, one historical film became the first ever blockbuster and forever shaped the way movies were made. That film was Birth of a Nation. D.W. Griffith's epic about post-Civil War America is famous for both its technical skill, but also infamous for its incredibly racist imagery. Specifically, its depiction of African Americans as villains, and its depiction of the racist organization the Ku Klux Klan as heroes. With Birth of a Nation, we get a film that lays the foundation for many of the technical aspects of movie making today. But the film also goes to the heart of the debate concerning how movies represent the past and how movies can represent people of color. So how does the film do all this? Well, just give me a few minutes of your time. Let's go back and take a closer look at Birth of a Nation. So in telling the story about life after and during the Civil War, Birth of a Nation is structured as a series of oppositions. The movie is built around the opposition of North versus South, Union versus Confederacy, peace versus war, and of course, black versus white. But at the time, in order to show how this then new medium of film could be different from, say, theater, D.W. Griffith had to pioneer many technical innovations, particularly the use of a technique called parallel editing. What is parallel editing? Well, parallel editing is when a film cuts back and forth between two scenes that are occurring simultaneously. There are several examples of this in the film, but Birth of a Nation doesn't just cut between two scenes. By accelerating the duration of the shots and by making faster and faster cuts between them, the suspense of each sequence becomes even more intensified. Now, this is evident in the film's infamous final sequence, in which the Ku Klux Klan comes to the rescue of a besieged town, a scene editing together two different locations, and that is scored to Wagner's Ride of the Valkyries.
Everybody able to hear what he was saying? Okay, so we'll pause right there, and we may come back to that, but I definitely want to kind of unpack what we're talking about when we're talking about Birth of a Nation. In Birth of a Nation, we're talking about 1915, we end up having D.W. Griffith bring this film that's supposed to be history to life. Remember, at that time, the Ku Klux Klan had basically disbanded. Remember, the Ku Klux Klan came about after the Civil War. You had former Civil War soldiers, you had other people who come together, and through the use of terrorism, they tried to basically control the black population and determine the direction of life in the South during Reconstruction and after. Remember, through terrorism, a lot of times when we hear people talk about 9/11, oh, it's the first time terrorism hit the United States. Oh, no, 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 no. We've been having terrorism in the United States for a long, long time, particularly terrorism against people who are marginalized, particularly against people of color, particularly the black community. So you have the Ku Klux Klan come together, utilizing terrorism. They're scaring people from exercising their right to vote. They're scaring people from being part of society. All right, they're using lynching, they're using scare tactics, all these different things, but over time, it starts to fall apart to a certain extent. Not to say it totally disappears, but it falls apart to a certain extent because, as we all know, in the South, they go from after the Civil War with black codes, which were basically black codes of conduct, or codes of conduct for black people in the South, where you couldn't be in a certain place at a certain time, you couldn't do this, you couldn't do that, basically criminalizing being black in the South. So they had things known as pig laws, where if you pick up a pig, you could get a long, if you steal a pig, you could get a long sentence in jail. If you were walking along the side of a railroad track carrying a bag, and all these different made up rules, well now if you happen to be black, you're going to get a long sentence in jail. All kinds of different elements. So if you start changing the codes, the local codes of law, on a local level and a state level, do you need the terrorism as much? Okay, we see that the rise of these domestic terrorist groups really come about when there's any push for rights. We see the Ku Klux Klan be strong in the middle of the 20th century. Well, what was going on? People were fighting for the right to vote. They were fighting against Jim Crow segregation. When we talk about 1915, early 20th century, we forget that that really could be seen as the beginnings of the modern civil rights movement. When we start to think about 1919, Bloody Summer, where you have World War I veterans coming back, black veterans being lynched in their uniforms, in their Army and Navy uniforms. I mean, this time period is a time period where black Americans are starting to say, okay, we're a generation removed. We still have people who were born in slavery, but now we're at a new place and we want to be treated with another level of respect. So it was almost that perfect storm that the Ku Klux Klan has started to die down, but now D.W. Griffith, he brings them back to life with this film, with this imagery of the possibility of intermarriage is one of the big themes in the film, where he says, oh, we can't have this. We can't have this. We have to fight against this. The black people are trying to take over the country. It's going to be a mongrel race. All of these racist tropes that we've seen throughout entertainment, not only from then, but up until now. The biggest fear is this whole idea of these black men. And remember, during Reconstruction, after the Civil War, you had a lot of people who had subscribed to the Confederacy. They were Confederate officers, Confederate citizens, whatever you want to call them. And they were for a little while barred from being part of public life, barred from public service. And also you had troops in the South protecting former slaves. So you had black people who were open to and allowed to be part of public life, run for office. They accomplished public office on a state level. They were elected to many different offices all over the country. And in this film, it retells that history a little bit differently. As opposed to saying, wow, this is amazing that people who have been enslaved, many of them, that when they're finally given freedom, they bring families together, they work for their communities, they try to utilize opportunities given to them and do some pretty impressive things in terms of establishing schools, being elected officials, all of those things. No, the story is retold decades later where they have scenes, and I don't think I'm going to use up all our time to keep bringing up clips, but if you go back to Birth of a Nation, there are scenes where they basically recreate legislative meetings, Congress or state legislature, where you have, these basically caricatures of black characters. The side characters sometimes are played by black actors, but all the main characters who are supposed to be black in the film are played by white actors and actresses in blackface. Okay, and so they end up they're drinking liquor, eating chicken, they're taking their shoes off in the halls of Congress, they're not getting anything done. They're basically, a lot of the stereotypes that we see thrown around today, these were stereotypes of that time, and because they got documented in film, they've stuck. Okay, so there's this whole idea of building a certain level of distrust. Not only will these black folks, when given the opportunity to lead politically, they'll harm our society. Not only will they do a bad job, but they're also going to rape white women. They're also going to tear the country down. They're in the middle of congressional proceedings with all of these caricatures of black men. And in the middle of the film, a white woman appears. If anybody's ever been to Congress, you know, they have balconies. So a white woman appears on the balcony, and now all the black men in Congress, they're distracted. Because that's who they're trying to get to. Okay? So they're building this whole idea that they have to be put in check. And the scene that you all saw, you had this idea that there were black troops. And people had kind of forgotten that, you know, over our time, people have forgotten the significance of black soldiers in the Civil War. But at this time in 1915, people still remembered this to a certain extent. So D.W. Griffith wanted to retell that story. So now those black soldiers and the whole idea of Reconstruction in the South, it was utterly disrespectful to white former Confederate soldiers and to white families, and they're trying to take over towns, and who's going to save them? You know, they're not going to save themselves, you know, from these black, you know, marauders. They're saved by the Ku Klux Klan. So just think about that today. If there was a film, you went over to, you know, Moline, to the Regal Theater, and they were like, you know, the journeys of the Ku Klux Klan or something. Nobody would want to be seen going into that film. But at this time, this was the hottest film, a blockbuster in the United States, where the Klan is glorified. So not too long after this film comes out, the Ku Klux Klan is reconstituted. Does anybody know where the modern Ku Klux Klan, what state it was reconstituted in? Indiana. Not far from here. So a lot of times, especially when I'm dealing with students, and we talk about, you know, domestic terrorism, and we talk about domestic racism and everything, they think it's exclusively a Southern thing. And they forget that in the Midwest is the home of the reestablishment of the Ku Klux Klan. The Midwest is the home of sundown towns. We've had it in and near this area, where there's certain periods in time where certain towns and cities would say, well, if you are not white, you can't be downtown or in this town after a certain period of time. And people were killed, they were maimed, they were run out of towns. People forget that Malcolm X was actually born and raised in Omaha, Nebraska, and his father was killed for speaking up, for being part of Marcus Garvey's movement for black independence, that the Midwest has its own story, and the Midwest has histories of domestic terrorism. Well, with all of those realities, we have this reinforcement from this film. And we have reinforcement after reinforcement of all of these different elements of painting a different picture of black people, painting different pictures of Latinos and other previously marginalized racial and ethnic groups through entertainment that play their way out in politics. So let's put ourselves in 1915. There's lots of people in the United States that maybe hadn't had interactions with black folks. And if they did have interactions with black folks in terms of the white majority, they're going to be very controlled interactions because of laws, because of practices, because of the way of the world of that time. So then they see this film. This is a totally new medium. This is a totally new way for them to have a story told to them. They're seeing it. And they're saying, well, wait a minute, this must have happened. Who's going to put all the money into this? So now you're shaping the way people feel about certain issues. So then in the decades to come, when people start saying, well, wait a minute, what about the rights of African Americans? Their rights are being infringed upon. They're not being treated as full-fledged citizens. Well, now people have Birth of a Nation and the film after that and the film after that, all these different films that they're seeing and all these different stories that are being told. Amos and Andy on the radio making up caricatures of black people in a very negative light. Amos and Andy on television making up caricatures of black people in black life. All of these different devices that are used to basically put black folks into a box. That, oh, they cannot be political leaders. They're not going to be worthy of having a real voice in our politics. Well, then people start to believe it. You start to believe what you see all the time. You know, you start to think about that. Why do you think that the way in which people reinforce their faith in any given religion is by using the same texts, using the same stories. I'm not saying that's a negative, but that's just human nature. You don't go to church every Sunday and they're like, oh, we got a new one. Hey, this is hot off the press. No, it's the Bible, it's the Quran, it's the Torah. Okay, you're going, regardless of where you're going to have the same text. They may pick something different out of it, but in the United States, we have a story. We have a story that's woven into our entertainment. And we have to be bold enough and we have to be strong enough to recognize where the myth making happens and where the reality is. Okay? So I want everybody in here to take a moment to just think about different portrayals that you can think of when it comes to people of color in various films and other settings. And think about some of the characters that we end up seeing. One of the stereotypes that we see in television and in particularly film when it comes to black folks in more modern forms of entertainment is this idea of the magical Negro, okay? It could be Red in Shawshank Redemption where he's just able to hold everything together. But more particularly, anybody remember the Green Mile? All these different, where you have Will Smith and the Legend of Bagger Vance, all these things where the black person is not a full-fledged member of the group. They're not a real person. They're allowed to be in the midst of all of these white main characters, and even if they're a black character, but they have to be magical. They have to provide some sort of service. They have to provide something special. They can't just be a regular black person living their life, okay? It's not to say that these are all bad films, because these can be some of your favorite films. That's perfectly fine, but think about what's being broadcast to you. When you have this idea of the magical Negro, the magical black person, as opposed to a black person who is going to be in the film and may face the same issues that anybody else may face, or face issues that pertain to their particular race in the United States of America. A lot of times we wash away the realities of race when we do present black folks as this magical Negro personification or this character that we see in all of these films. It really takes away the reality that we have, that black folks may have issues that they have to deal with. So then when you have something like a Michael Brown shooting in Ferguson, or when you have other issues of violence against black people, well then stories that can be told about the mythical power of black people, that, oh, the more that I shot that person, the more that he got stronger and was able to come at me. Well, now you've had this, hey, well, if they can be the magical Negro to save things and be extra strong, and I can watch John Coffey in The Green Mile and all these other films, and then we also have these negative portrayals, well, now I can piece that together. Well, maybe so. Maybe if somebody were to get shot more and more, they get stronger and stronger because, hey, it's a totally different circumstance than the reality that anybody may think of or know as an audience member. Some other stereotypes that we have. We also have this idea of the black best friend. Many movies that we see, there's a black character, but is the black character the main character? No, the black character is going to be the side character. The black character, a lot of times, is going to be the person in a supporting role. So how does that play out in politics? Well, as long as you don't want to take the lead, black community, as long as you don't want to take the lead, black leader, as long as you want to fit into the mold of supporting whatever is of importance to the mainstream society or to the majority of the society, that's fine. Even if you want to be the elected official, there's a certain box that people have to fit into. And we see that not only when it comes to blacks in politics, but when it comes to Latinos, when it comes even to women in politics. Anybody who has traditionally been excluded from the political process, in particular by being an elected official, a lot of times, if they're not going to subscribe to basically replicating what the majority had already done, then a lot of times they're looked at as, wait, you're causing trouble. What are you trying to do? Are you trying to take over? Why are you trying to rock the boat? Well, the same thing can be said with the way in which we see these characters in these films over and over again, because on the surface, it's a very positive portrayal. Well, that's a friend. You know, hey, it's a black friend, they're a good person. They're positive, but are they allowed to have agency of their own? In many cases, not. They're not, and if that character is ever written where they step out of line, you know, it just doesn't work. It doesn't work in this storytelling. So it's usually they're going to be there, they're going to be present, but they're definitely going to be somebody that if they're pulled out of the film's still going to go on. They're going to give a few quick, you know, witty one-liners, a few little jokes. They're going to be there to support that main character, but they're not going to be there to say, man, guess what happened today? I was racially profiled at the mall. Or, wow, you know, guess what happened today? You know, I had to go to a rally. I was fighting for justice. Oh, no, you know, that's going to mess with the storyline. They need to be there to be in a very supporting role. We also see this whole idea of the brash woman, the brash black woman, that a lot of times black women, that basically their womanhood is altered or taken away in modern entertainment. In the film Birth of a Nation, it was all about, you know, the chastity and you know, almost the royalty of white womanhood, and that these black men were trying to take it away. And the black women who were portrayed in the film many times were these scheming mulattoes, so mixed race black women played by white women in blackface or tan face or whatever you want to call it. But it definitely was taking away their agency as women, their agency as being significant parts of their own community or the community as a whole. And we see that over and over again. We can go to Gone with the Wind, we could go to The Help, all of these different places where they're either going to be helpers or they're going to be the brash sidekick friend. They're going to do the quips, all of those kind of things. So we see that. So once again, well, what about when a black woman decides to run for office? Black women, on top of being women and having to deal with so many different things that come down and barriers that are put in place of women when they try to run for office, when they even think about or consider running for office, they also have many issues that come with them when it comes to the intersection of their identity. So being black and being a woman in the United States of America. Well, how will they dress? How will they do their hair? Well, if they speak too boldly, well, are they being a loud, quote unquote, angry black woman? Are they being somebody who can work with everyone else? Are they overbearing to their men in their community? They have so many things they have to think about besides just, I was elected, the people want me to do a job, let me do that job. So there's layers upon layers of things that sometimes they may have to think about if they choose to enter the political arena, that sometimes are reinforced through entertainment that we don't even think of as having a big plan. It's just, hey, that's the way entertainment is given to us, okay? So those are some of the things that we think about that started with Birth of a Nation, but still continue. We have this whole idea of domestics. You know, this whole idea of The Help. The whole idea of black people being there to serve the white majority in politics, in movies. We even think about it when it comes to the way in which many times political organizations, campaigns even interact with black communities, with Latino communities. They don't show up on a regular basis in many cases. They show up when it's time for the votes, okay? They show up, and that's the same thing that we see in films. Hold your place in the film until we need to show the interaction with The Help, until we need that type of support, okay? So we see it over and over again. This isn't in every film, but it's definitely something that's there. And if we're going to have some kind of lead role or lead story based around people of color, they're going to be The Help. You guys know the film The Help. Or they're going to be some negative stereotype of thugs, killers, gangsters, things of that nature. Not to say that none of these things exist. There are people of color who are The Help. There are people of color who make gangsters, thugs, whatever else. But there are also the vast majority of people are going to be members of their families. They're going to have various professions. They're going to be fathers, mothers, brothers, daughters. They're going to be neighbors. They're going to be church members, all of those things. Okay? But through entertainment, a lot of times, those things aren't as fun. Those things don't sell as much. When we take a look at modern entertainment, we have reality shows that sometimes have black people starring in them, but they're not showing the positivity that's there. They're not showing people a vision of the potential of what's behind some of these black folks who may want to run for office or may want to lead communities. You're going to see people arguing, yelling. You're going to see people doing things for money that they shouldn't be doing in many cases. You see a lot of negative portrayals, be it on television and films. And it's one thing to have negative portrayals because every group has some negative portrayals, but where's the balance? And when we look at something like Birth of a Nation and the films that have come forth in the 100 years since we had Birth of a Nation, you see a lot of imbalance. And you see a lot of those same stories, a lot of those same tropes used in American politics. Sorry for checking my watch. I'm going to make sure I don't keep you guys over because I know it's rude to check your watch when you're talking. But I don't want to keep people from doing what they have to do. But in any case, when we talk about these things, we start to see that these caricatures have been used over and over again in American politics. And now people have gotten so good at it that when people actually discuss issues of race, racism, sexism, if they talk about homophobia, Islamophobia, any kind of discrimination, a lot of times those very people who are saying, hey, wait a minute, I can't take it anymore, this is too much for me to handle, can you pull back on the racism, they're accused of being racist. The conversation shifts to the person who is the victim who's saying, wait a minute, can we do better? Well, why are you talking about race? Because the people who are in the political discourse in a modern era, they have figured out ways in many cases to talk about race, to basically promote racist imagery and racist ideas through the use of dog whistle politics, okay? So what we mean is that our popular culture has done such a good job in establishing these negative stereotypes that started all the way with Birth of a Nation and before, and continuing those negative stereotypes that when it fits the narrative, black people are lazy. When it fits the narrative, black people work hard and are happy to be mistreated. It just depends on the story that's being told. When it fits the narrative, black people are just naturally criminalistic. They're going to be criminals. Other times, when it fits the narrative in various stories, well, black people are going to be portrayed as they're using drugs at a much higher rate than anyone else. So when you take those narratives and you combine them with some of the realities in the ways in which our laws are enforced, and then we combine them with some of the ways in which we see our elected officials say the things that they say and do the things that they do, well, it's almost hard to blame people for believing these negative stereotypes. And it opens the door for people to not have to say something that would technically be racist or even pertaining to race, yet everybody understands even if they don't consciously understand. They may subconsciously understand. Okay, so an example. When we talk about the Southern strategy, all right? Everybody in here, you know, I'm assuming everybody in here, or most people in here, have a little bit of understanding that if we look at the middle of the 20th century, the South was solidly Democratic, okay? And you have the civil rights movement going on, and this is when, once we hit the early 60s, that's actually when those Southern states, many of them, started deciding to incorporate the Confederate battle flag of Northern Virginia into their state capitals, into their state flags, as a form of resistance of the federal government, because the federal government was siding with people who said, hey, the Constitution guarantees me some civil rights. I'd like to, you know, get up on some of that. Give me some of those civil rights, okay? So we start to see this push. Once Lyndon Johnson, President of the United States in the mid-60s, signs the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, later the Fair Housing Act, it's basically understood that the South is not going to be solidly Democratic anymore. The party has split. You end up seeing basically a region without a party for a little while. The Republican Party decides, many leaders within the Republican Party, not all rank and file Republicans, but they decide that they're going to engage in a Southern strategy. And in that Southern strategy, it was basically some of the beginnings of this idea of dog whistle politics. So hey, let's utilize what's already being said in popular culture. Let's utilize what's already being said and has been said in the media in terms of these negative stereotypes of individuals of color. We're not going to appeal directly to the racists. We don't even have to be, you know, stone cold racist ourselves, but we know who the voters are in the South. So we'll make subtle appeals to make people feel comfortable. An example would be in 1980, for the 1980 election. I believe it actually happened in 79, but between 79 and 80, President Ronald Reagan decides to announce his presidency in Philadelphia, Mississippi. Philadelphia, Mississippi, home of Mississippi Burning, home of, you know, Klan activity, people being lynched, all kinds of things going on. He decides to go there. When we think of Philadelphia, Mississippi right now, you know, we think of the movie Mississippi Burning. Or we think of, you know, what was the guy, the football player? Marcus Dupree came out of Philadelphia, Mississippi. We think of all these different things, and if we think about the racism of the past, the fights for the civil rights movement, to us in 2015, well, that was 50 years ago. But in 1980, it was a decade and a half ago. Okay, so in 1980, he's going to Philadelphia, Mississippi to announce his presidency, and guess what his speech was about? States' rights. Okay, Ronald Reagan didn't say a racist thing out of his mouth at that announcement, but he physically positioned himself in Philadelphia, Mississippi, where this story is known, talking about states' rights, talking about how the people in the state of Mississippi should be able to have control over their destiny. Some of the same rhetoric that had been used during the Civil War in terms of state rights, in terms of in the mid-1900s when we talk about the 50s and the 60s, when it comes to fights against civil rights, states' rights. All right? We see later on in Reagan's administration where he decides to utilize this whole idea of welfare queens and young bucks getting money and all this different terminology that harken back to old entertainment and old stories and old stereotypes of black people without genuinely talking about black people, but people relating to it because they've been inundated with it throughout their history. Does everybody understand how sometimes you can make certain appeals because you know what your audience knows? If I'm speaking to you all here in Rock Island, there are certain things that I can talk about without really going into great detail. You know, I can just throw out a Whitey's versus country style reference. And people are like, oh yeah, you know, soft serve, hard ice cream, this, that, and other. Did I have to explain any of that? No. Well, if I'm talking to an audience of potential voters, if I'm talking to people who are my constituents, and I know the movies they watch, I know the news channels they watch, I know the newspapers that they read, I know if they watch, you know, Lawrence O'Donnell on MSNBC or they watch Bill O'Reilly on Fox News, I know who they listen to, I have an idea, well then I can have touch points that I can talk about to either try to stop these various racial stereotypes and portrayals, or to basically feed into them and to use them to get to my ends, okay? So D.W. Griffith really gave us a blueprint, but we see a lot of other people who have extended that blueprint. We see effects in our culture, in our politics today, all right? So I had a lot more that I could talk about, and you guys can find me somewhere, but I definitely don't want to keep anybody, and I do want to give you all time for some questions. So Kai and everybody, is that good? So yeah. We can start with some questions here. Like I said, I wish we had hours because I could sit and talk about this forever, but let's go with some questions. So I'll start here and come to you. Okay.
So what in D.W.'s personal background or life led him to make this film and be so supportive of the plans?
I won't want to lie to you and say that I know a lot about his personal background. There's a lot of research on his personal background. I know that the little bit that I do know is that he seemed to be very committed to, you know, a certain way of life, you know, for the South. He seemed committed to basically maintaining a certain way of life for the United States of America. And he certainly had political leanings that were reflected in the film. But in terms of going further than that, I'm sure there's somebody else or another book, but I don't want to give false information based off assumptions that I may have. That I may have to talk to one of my history colleagues to get you a little bit more info on that. So, yes.
Clarification, and also if you could comment on something else. The dog whistle politics, if you could clarify that.
Okay.
And secondly, would you comment on the local media here
Okay.
in reference to these
Okay.
issues.
So to clarify, yeah, thank you for bringing me back to that. So when we talk about dog whistle politics, it's basically times in which we see politicians being equipped with the possibility of talking about something without talking about it. So talking about race without talking about race. If you have, let's say in a modern context, this whole idea of we have a nation full of takers. And now you're talking about race and class, but you're making this very general appeal. Oh, you have this nation of takers. You know, if you start talking about this whole idea of, you know, where you have people who have put together a Black Lives Matter movement, all right? And the idea where they say, wait a minute, you know, we have a long history in the United States of America of, in various ways, Black lives not being considered as valuable. We're talking about being first-class citizens in terms of attacks on people's actual lives, attacks or a devaluation of Black lives when we talk about education systems, mass incarceration, all of these things. They genuinely, these young people say, wait a minute, we just want to remind everybody that Black lives matter. And instead of people saying, oh, okay, well, you know, I may agree with you or disagree with you on other political matters, but that seems like something where probably, you know, history kind of shows that there have been issues when it comes to respect for Black lives, regardless of where it's coming from in the United States. All right, well, no, the first attack is this whole idea of, well, what about all lives matter? What about blue lives matter? What about all these things? And it turns it into this idea of, well, you're not worthy to say that Black lives matter. So that's even a more modern form of dog whistle politics in basically having the ability to quickly change the focus of something that is very serious that people have a real issue with. Well, no, well, we're not going to talk about why you're saying Black Lives Matter. We're going to talk about why you're not saying these 10 other things. Any of those things can sometimes be dog whistle politics. Let me think of another example. I mean, anytime that you have people being able to talk, you know, if you say, you know, urban crime. Well, urban means you're in a city. But everybody knows, you know, urban music. All of that stuff is black. You know, oh, well, you know, there's urban decay. So the buildings are falling down, but then it's this, you know, you transfer the issue of maybe people leaving a city or a city losing industry to, well, look at what the black folks have done. You know, so you end up having these automatics where people have been told these stories over and over again, and you could get up as a politician or a candidate and use, you know, the word urban in various contexts, or, you know, well, what about all lives matter, or, you know, this whole idea of when Ronald Reagan uses the term welfare queen. But when he uses the term welfare queen, I hear people groaning, but welfare queen, those words don't connect to any racial group, but people kind of followed what he was talking about. He's painting this image of this woman riding in a Cadillac, collecting checks from all these different places. So he's able to utilize dog whistle politics without saying, well, black people are digging into your pocket and they're taking it. And without dealing, I got you 1 minute, Terry, without dealing with the reality that the majority of people who were gaining those benefits were not black at all. You know, so reality doesn't connect to dog whistle politics. Dog whistle politics connects to perceptions. Perceptions that are ingrained and reinforced through television shows, movies, you know, conversations people have when they're ill-informed, and it just builds upon itself. And if you have your finger on the pulse of what your audience may think or what they think they know, then you can tap into that without ever getting yourself dirty. Because then you can walk out and say, I didn't say anything about black people. I made a little joke about welfare queens. I didn't say black. I said, you know, X, Y, Z. I didn't say anything against Black Lives Matter, about black people fighting for justice. I said all lives matter. So what are you attacking me for? Don't all lives matter? You know, and it's like, well, yes, of course all lives matter. The whole idea of the movement is to say black lives should be part of that all. You know, but it's an easy cop-out to say, okay, dog whistle politics, but it's set up by our entertainment. It's set up by the fact anytime you turn on a cop show, you're going to see a black or Latino person getting locked up, and they're going to get roles as the thug, but not as, you know, the person who is in a higher position. In many cases, you know, things have gotten better. Terry.
I just want to add to your thought, Chris. You know, for example, President Obama. You know, they keep talking about the fact, is he American? You know, this is not the way America is. We want America the way it was. Those are perfect examples of what I see. You know, black men on the rise, or those type of things. You know, it's just, you know, we pick it up. Being black, I pick it up right away. You know, color code, he's American. He happens to be an African American president. You know, just the way things are being stated.
Yeah.
We pick it up all the time.
That whole idea of making the person of color into the other, that he's anything other than a legitimate American president. Two-term president, you know, long list of accomplishments, you can agree or not agree, but the accomplishments are there. But is he really an American? Did we get bamboozled? And I always tell my students, well, I used to teach at the Naval Academy when I was in graduate school. And if you would see the background check that they made for me just to teach a class per semester, I'm like, well, wait a minute, they're calling people up doing all of this stuff. And you're going to tell me the commander-in-chief was able to, he's smooth enough to, you know, slip through the cracks? I mean, that everybody knows that he's an American, but it's a good excuse to say, well, he's something other than. It's perfectly fine to disagree with the man. It's perfectly fine to want somebody else in there, but disagree with him on his policies. Disagree on some element of how he's doing the job, as opposed to, well, is he really even legitimately our president? That, Terry, that's a perfect example of dog whistle politics, where you can have a whole interview on a cable news show about the whole birther belief, and you're never actually talking about presidential politics, but you're constantly bringing the person down and bringing up these ideas that people have that, yeah, he's not one of us, and then you're able to do the whole, we want our country back. Well, you want, who took it? Where did it go? It's here. It didn't go anywhere. Yes.
I think during Obama's term, race has certainly, you know, been a primary conversation, but I look at Ben Carson and I hear virtually nothing and I read nothing about his ethnic background. Is that because Obama took everything because he was the first? Or, I mean, has other people noticed that, I guess?
Well, I mean, Ben Carson, he has an interesting story. I mean, his claim to fame for much of his life. I mean, I grew up in Baltimore. Ben Carson's whole career was in Baltimore. Ben Carson was a hero of mine, a hero of many people. Coming to schools, you know, my mom gave me the book, Gifted Hands. I mean, he was in particular a hero to young black kids who were growing up all over the country. They're like, man, look at what Ben Carson did. But if you pay attention, I always tell people, read what Ben Carson says. Read what a lot of these candidates say, be it Bernie Sanders, Ben Carson, Hillary Clinton, Donald Trump. Actually get transcripts, read interviews, where then you take out the visual. You take out you know, Donald Trump has all this bluster. And, you know, Ben Carson is really calm and relaxed. But if you actually read the words that they say, then you'll start to actually get more of a feel for what they're all about. It's not to say never watch them, but really get a feel. When he does talk about issues of race, he totally goes against anything that's currently going on in most cases in terms of pushes for liberation, freedom, justice within the black community. So then it makes it easy for people to say, well, he's good. It's the whole idea that President Obama has been painted as this radical, as this, well, he's not. I mean, within the black community, people are like, you know, a lot of people who are activists are like, come on, Barack Obama, you know, what's going on here? We have a lot that we want to get done. But when you talk about this narrative with Barack Obama, he's the socialist, he's just trying to hook up the black community. And then you have Ben Carson, who's been painted in somewhat due to some of the things that he may have said, but also by the media. A lot of this is out of his control. It's just based on the message that he chooses to convey as almost the anti-Obama. So then if we've ascribed race and issues of race and everything's been thrown to President Obama, well, now Ben Carson is on the other hand, or the other side, so then people automatically say, oh, well, yeah, you know, physically he's black, but he's not worried about all those quote-unquote black issues. And really, they're issues for America. I remember when the Charleston shooting happened, I had an email sent to me by someone who said, well, I feel for you and your people. This must be a hard day for you all. And I said, what the hell are you talking about? This should be, are you an American? This is a hard day for people. This is a hard day for Americans. When they have a mass shooting at a white school, I don't send emails to my white friends and say, hey, white friend, you know, I'm sure feeling for you today. Though I feel bad. I'm like, kids got killed. You know, Americans got killed. But we still have certain levels of divides. What we see with Ben Carson, where a lot of times he wants to take race out of everything. Okay, and that, you know, that's the politics that he wants to engage in. That's perfectly fine. Where, oh, well, everything is an individual incident as opposed to looking at systematic or institutional racism. And if you don't talk about that, then that makes people a lot more comfortable if it's an individual incident as opposed to institutional things that have been drawn out. And that's perfectly his right. You know, it's the United States of America, but that's why sometimes I think perceptions may be a little different. Terry, and then here, and then here.
You know, another thing, Ben Carson get away with things that a public white person can get away with. For example, compare Obamacare to slavery.
Mm-hmm.
You know, how could you put those two things together, slavery and Obamacare? So they're saying that healthcare is a way of enslaving people. I don't really that believe. They make statements that some of the other candidates can't.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, yeah, definitely.
we have conflict with that in our community.
A certain level of freedom with that. Yeah. Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Do you see a role played by the Great Migration and the development of these sentiments?
I think that when we talk about the Great Migration, so everybody's on the same page, there were a few waves of the Great Migration in the first half of the 20th century. I'm actually a product of that. My grandfather migrated from North Carolina to Baltimore to work in steel mills because his family was one of the few families in Roxborough, North Carolina, in terms of black families who own their own land. And when we started to have farm subsidies and other things go through with the New Deal, as some people in here may know, a lot of those federal subsidies were run through county agents. Well, guess what? County agents in Roxborough, North Carolina did not want to see a black family farm survive. So a decision was made by all the Whitts that they're going to send their oldest sons. And there was a lot of them because he came from one of those big farm families. So there's a lot of oldest sons. They all were going to hit different cities on the East Coast. And they were going to get jobs and they were going to support the family farms because the banks weren't helping, the farm bureaus, none of those were helping. They were going to do it themselves. So he did it. He went to Baltimore. A couple other cousins went to Baltimore. Some cousins went to Paterson, New Jersey. So now we have Whitts all in the Mid-Atlantic because of that. But when and you have people who went to Chicago, Milwaukee, Indianapolis, the Quad Cities, all kinds of places. They were either looking for opportunity or many times they were just seeking to escape persecution. Where we had the flood of, I can't remember the year, I think it's 1924, one of these years in the 20s. There's a big flood in the Mississippi Delta, and you had thousands upon thousands of people run to Chicago. Well, why did they wait for this flood to run to Chicago? Well, they left because the lawmakers, the law enforcers, and the property owners were all in cahoots in the South, along with the terrorists, the Klan. And that people were constantly being put into more and more debt over and over again through sharecropping and other means, where it was almost a modernized version of slavery, where they couldn't leave. If they tried to leave these towns, they were going to be killed, they were going to be hurt, their families would be hurt. But when the flood hits, it's a sense of freedom where they're like, well, there's chaos and we're jumping on a train, we're getting out of here, we're getting on a truck, wherever, and a lot of them ended up in Chicago. A lot of them ended up in other cities. So that's just a quick background. Great migration, people moving for various reasons. Well, when they go to these areas, a lot of times we end up having people become parts of unions or they're challenging for jobs, and they're faced with a lot of the same issues that immigrants had faced from other countries. So when Irish get here, they're treated a certain way. When people come from Italy, they're treated a certain way. But on top of that, them being new immigrants to these cities, you have this underlying history of race and racism in the United States of America. So then you have a disconnect of understanding between the white majority and these new arrivals. And then you have the old stories of the South So it's easy to play that out in television shows. It's easy to play those things out in movies. This whole idea of the potential of black people. Well, all the black folks I know are, working in helping professions, or they're at the bottom of the barrel at the job, or they're not the most educated. So that must be a commentary on their character as opposed to their circumstance. Okay, that's one of the differences in the United States when it comes to race, that throughout our history, and for the Bible scholars out there, you guys know slavery was nothing new. We had slavery for a long time, but in the past, in other circumstances, slavery was basically, you were in a condition of slavery. That, your tribe or your town or whatever had been taken over. So now you were in a condition of slavery for a set amount of time, but you were still a person who was enslaved. But in the United States, when we enact chattel slavery, the type of slavery that we had in the United States, where people were looked at as chattel, like animals, where them and their offspring and their offspring's offspring were all going to be owned, and they were going to be looked at differently. And the only people who were subjected to that in a massive way happened to be black folks. Well, now when slavery ends, the feeling that the people who have been enslaved were inferior has already been instilled in the society. Everybody follow me with that? That it's not just, oh, these people happen to be people who were enslaved, now they're not. Well, no, these were the people that helped establish the country, and because of their physical characteristics, they were enslaved and they were forever marked with that. Well, now you take that history and you take it with people coming with the Great Migration, and coming sometimes without anything, monetarily, without a lot of education, with a lot of other issues, and then you start reinforcing it with the stories and Reader's Digest of the time, or Harper's, or television shows or radio shows with negative stereotypes. Well, it's hard to shake that. That's a lot of information being thrown at people, where today in 2015, if you're raised in America, even if you're a person of color, you sometimes have implicit racial bias against black people. Okay, so you can be black and still have negative stereotypes of other black people, just because we're all part of this society that's based on entertainment that perpetuates and perpetuates and perpetuates. Okay, so that's a reality, and that's how, my long-winded answer of connecting it to the Great Migration. So.